Welcome to Certes IT Service Solution Podcasts. In this episode, our host, Jon Grainger, CTIO, chats to Dr. Nick Fine, who is a user research specialist. With their vast amount of experience, they discuss the reasons behind the increased demand for user research within the public sector. Let's dive in.
Okay, Nick, well, thanks ever so much for joining us. I'm very, very excited to talk to you around user research. Typically what we do here is it's a conversation. If we want to go down a rabbit hole, we can, and I'll try and cover as much ground as possible. Sometimes what we do is we then see if we can have like a sister session, which is like a webinar. And so people see this one, come up with a load of questions, and we do a webinar, and sometimes with a couple of other panelists. So see where it takes us. But just to sort of set everyone else up who's watching this. So basically, we're looking at user research, as always in the public sector, but also the fact that there's a trend for increasing demand in user research. But before we get into the exam question, as it were, Nick. Could you give us a bit of an intro about yourself? What's your background in user research within public sector? Is it the sort of thing you fall into, or do you have a passion for it? Just talk us through.
Well, lots of questions in there. So I'm a user researcher or UX consultant, as we used to be known. And I've been doing that for about 13 or 14 years, since around 2009. I've been a freelancer for about 9 of those years, and probably 5 of those years were spent in central government or local government. Actually, I spent some time at City Hall. So those are my experiences. 2 or 3 quite large engagements in different corners of central government, delivering quite large infrastructure projects. My passion is for user research and is for the user, and in this scenario, the citizen. That's where my passion comes from, and whether it's public or private sector, I guess it's really the same. My lens obviously and my behavior has to change in the public sector. It's a different world. It has different challenges and complexities, but I guess we'll come into that throughout the course of our discussion.
Cool. Okay, Nick, so here's one of my favorite sorts of questions, which is explain user research to a 5-year-old.
Okay, it's quite simply, user research is just about understanding users and their needs in their context.
Okay.
Quite simply.
Okay, cool. So in terms of user research, and particularly in the public sector, you mentioned citizen. So I suppose if you put the definition together in public sector, what's driving? I mean, if we didn't have user research, what would that world look like?
Oh, that's easy. It looks like the old orange world of direct.gov and the other stuff that happened before the 2004 or 2014? I always get that wrong. Before GDS was born, before Lisa Reichelt's amazing transformational work. It was a dark ages of needs not being met, of government building services that they think people need in the wrong way. And that's what a user researcherless world looks like.
And how did that revolution come about? Because I was in professional services, private sector, sort of on a other side of the table, and I remember all of that happening, and it was like this sort of mini explosion that then turned into this sort of, the governance that they put down across UK public sector happened, I thought, really quickly and very, authoritatively. Did you see that sort of unfold, and did you have any stories about that?
No, I think I joined the party a little bit after that in terms of my first public sector engagement. I think it was 2014 that Lisa's work was pretty much where it all started. My first public sector engagement with any real meaning, actually no, it was 2017 at the Home Office. So it had been up and running for a number of years, and I think it's fair to say, this is controversial, but that's what we're after, I think. There is a cult of GDS in central government, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It comes with a lot of very good things. There's a lot of passion, a lot of care, but it also comes with quite a lot of negatives too. the amazing set of principles, the GDS standards themselves, is phenomenal. It was recently evolved and kind of, I think it was abstracted down from 14 to 12, but they are phenomenal principles. They are really amazing principles, and the more and more I work with them, the more and more I learn about them and understand them more. And you don't really understand the value of them until you've really worked with them. Because on the surface of it, on the face of it, you think, it's just more rules and things I can't do in a very difficult, complicated, interconnected place. But when you start to understand the value of those principles and how to execute them, and that they are principles, not rules, they are phenomenal. And that's what kind of changed the world. And it's the execution of those principles that produces good user-centric services.
Yeah. So okay. So a principle for me is a bit like a compass heading. It's not being overly prescriptive, but it's something that if you're in touch with, you kind of know when you're following a principle and when you're not. But it won't be so prescriptive to tell you exactly what to do. You mentioned these great principles. Do you have one? I won't ask you to rank them and regurgitate all of them, but what comes to mind when you think of some of those key principles? And why are they so powerful?
Sorry, I have got the actual service standard up in front of me. Now, these are amazing. Now, if anybody who hasn't, I strongly recommend you just if you Google GDS service standard, it will come straight back to you as the first one. The first point is all about understanding users and their needs, which was that definition we talked about. Solve a whole problem for users. Provide a joined-up experience across all channels. Now, in central government, which is inherently interconnected and complex, that's a very important thing, because that experience, the experience that the user or the citizen has, needs to not... They don't care about all the interconnections internally. They just care about doing a thing, meeting their need. So these principles are phenomenal, but if there's ever any struggle, it's in the interpretation of those principles. And then when I'm talking about a cult of GDS, often there are certain ways of interpreting certain principles in certain cultures, in certain corners of government. And so it gets a little adversarial, but actually it only produces gold, or it tends to produce gold. Okay.
It's quite a claim there, Nick. So one of the things that we said in the title of this is that user research hasn't peaked. It's actually it's having increased demand. So what's driving the increased demand for user research? And I suppose just to throw a challenge in, does that mean we haven't got reuse and we're kind of applying it again and again in specific areas, or is it just sort of exponential demand in digital? By the way, I don't like the term digital, but sort of technology-enabled citizen services.
Yeah.
Is that just skyrocketing in terms of demand? What's driving or is it legacy? Is it going over sort of legacy systems and having to sort of catch up? Or is it all of the above? What's driving this increase?
I think it's very much all of the above, and probably quite a lot more. There are, in terms of KPIs and delivering change, you need user researchers in order to understand and to execute. So whether you're actually discovering a thing right at the beginning of a big piece of work, that discovery phase, or you're evaluating a thing to see, is it any good, how can we make it better, both of those tasks require a user research, and a really competent one. Or lots of them. That's why. So whenever you're building or maintaining anything, a researcher is involved.
Cool. I'm linking a little bit back to the intro. I just sort of wanted your thoughts on, okay, so it's growing rapidly. You've got folks who really understand it, but obviously if it's growing rapidly, you've probably got the need for new people to come in or to grow the profession at some point. What do you think are the really good kind of background characteristics of someone who's going to make a great user researcher? What's the sort of, what are the traits? What's and maybe also thinking about existing folks within public sector that might be kind of where you'd go to, obvious places to maybe train people from.
Yeah, that's really good. User research in the public sector is a different beast. It very much is so. So I'm going to give you what I would consider characteristics or traits of the public sector researcher, because it's a more advanced version of the private sector researcher, if I'm brutally honest. there's a level of top-down or objectivity that is needed because of the interconnectivity of government itself. There is such complexity that I've never seen, even in one of the multinational private sector entities. It's so big, and it's regulated in ways that other entities aren't. And so the user researcher very much has to be a much more resilient kind of a user researcher, must be much more interconnected. When I say political, I don't mean that like a politician, but somebody who understands and can swim in those waters. Somebody who understands influence, because that's a really big deal. I mean, again, I've had much success being a show pony because I can present, and I present well. And that's what's needed when you're presenting user research or user insight that's going to move the needle, or save costs or do a thing. But sometimes the research that's reported back is controversial. It's not what people wanted to hear or expected to hear or had planned to hear.
Yes.
And these things get messy.
Yeah, I love that. I love that view that you're saying that sometimes the data or the findings just doesn't match what the original vision was, or the kind of the anecdotal or intuitive view. Intuition can often be proved wrong, and it's quite a disconcerting process to go through, particularly if you had a really strong intuition. And I think there is an element of the skills that you need for user research, but also if you're in a technology leadership position, you've got to create an environment that will actually accept facts.
Okay, we call this evidence-driven government, or evidence-based decision-making.
Yes,
evidence-based policy making, which a few years ago was a big deal, and I haven't been connected to it, but I very much hope it's still growing.
Yes, which is, that's a big dynamic for democracy, and that's a huge topic, way beyond user research. But actually, there's a bit of a golden thread there, isn't there?
Yes.
Linking the two.
100%.
You mentioned moving the needle. It would be great if you could, and if you can't get one right now, we could come back to it, but give us some kind of example of how user research has really positively impacted something in the public sector or a particular initiative. I mean, you already mentioned that there was perhaps some intuition that got met with some facts, so that probably led to a course alteration that might not have occurred. As one, but do you have any examples that you're allowed to? You can sort of anonymize them or speak in generalities. It's always difficult, isn't it?
It is really difficult. What I can say, generally speaking, is that because of the nature of GDS and because of the nature it is so inherently user-centric, that we cannot pass an assessment in today's world, a GDS service assessment, to go from discovery to alpha to beta to live, without it seeing citizens or users or all of the people who are intending to use that service. That means it can't go that far wrong or that far off the rails. It also means that every service you've seen that's good is informed by user research as a fact, by de facto, or whatever you call it. I'm going to give you some more spicy examples here, because this is I'm talking completely openly and generally speaking here. There are power dynamics because we're talking about public money, and we're talking about the way that the money flows and the reporting back of value, effectively.
Yeah.
It gets really difficult when, at a ministerial level, there are decisions being made at a very high top table political level that don't meet the needs of the audience, or the audience doesn't reflect that direction that they're going. And then you have senior SROs in the chain, in the mix, and things can really get very difficult. So user research can do some very powerful things, but they also make some very powerful challenges upstairs, which again makes this public sector very unique in that regard.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. It is almost like democratizing systems development. Well, not systems development, but the sort of information, the government information architecture. So yeah, it's funny. You look at it and you think, what's the buzz? What's the excitement? You can see it in your face, Nick. It's like, and we've had a couple of other user experience kind of sessions as well, and there's a sort of real passion behind it. But I suppose there must be there is tremendous satisfaction from making this really strong connection between what it is you're actually doing and knowing that it's meeting a need, rather than, I think we've all been on various projects where people are like, well, I've no idea why we're doing this, or, I'm not talking potentially in current context, but there's always a risk. I suppose that is the ultimate risk. If you don't have user research, that's got to be a huge part of your quality assurance framework sort of gone, because you're not having that test. Well, one of the things, Nick, I wanted to ask you as well is, how much of user research do you rely on having, a really fast kind of feedback between, the technology change, the impact, and the feedback? Because I presume if we were in the bad old days of very, very long linear deterministic kind of methods, there isn't even a stage to kind of validate. There's just one at the end to say whether you got it right or not. So you could use, maybe you'd use it in design and then you'd use it at the end. But I presume you really need iteration. I mean, it must be absolutely inherent in user research, isn't it?
100%. One of the best projects I worked on, and also one of the biggest and most challenging, was with the Home Office. And again, I'll talk very generally. There's nothing I'm going to divulge here. But as I think most people, it's common knowledge, 5 years ago we replaced the passport system, and I was part of the team doing that.
Wow.
It means you can now get your passport as an adult renewal back in, I think, 4 days. It's completely automated, largely automated, very amazing stuff. Lots of cool technology going on. That project, which I was a part of for about 2 years, involved myself and another user researcher getting up at 4 a.m., flying at 6 a.m. twice a week for the first part of the sprint, to do the discovery part, to speak to the various roles involved in building this thing. Then in the second week of the sprint, we would be testing a prototype, or actual, in this case, testing code that we'd learned in the first week. So in a 2-week cycle, it's called dual track agile. We were actually learning and building in a 2-week cycle, and we learned things that changed the direction that we were going in. So those 2-week agile sprints moved, and it was phenomenal.
But on the dual track, so were you doing discovery every other sprint, or did you do discovery once?
Every sprint.
Yeah, because I always, my sort of early experience with agile was, very exciting, but I saw this huge weight on getting the design right, or design's probably the wrong word, just the kind of the sense of the product and where you're going and all of your kind of assumptions, because otherwise you've got a stale design that then just has iterative work on it, but you'll still end up with something that's probably a little bit stale, but actually you're using discovery to sort of course correct as you go.
Yep. And I should clarify, it's not your traditional spend 6 months to a year type discovery about should and how we build this service type thing, or is there a need for this kind of a service. It's more, here's a function, we're building a part of a thing, but I don't know about how to build that particular function, so I'm going to go speak to subject matter experts and the actual people doing the job to find out what that stuff is, and then bake it in.
Okay, so I've done a fair bit of work in the public sector myself, and I am assuming discovery, really valuable discovery, is getting in front of the right people, and a lot of those people aren't necessarily folks that have just got time on their hands or even inclined to have a meeting with you and all the rest of it. So that must have been quite a challenge to identify the right folks and actually even get in front of them, or did you find actually generally people were just wanted to, just talk to you openly? What was that challenge like?
Remember, not all users of government services are external citizens.
Yes.
I mean, obviously they're a massive chunk, but there's a lot of civil servants internally who are using systems, and a specialist role was my main audience, and they were an internal user. The challenges there are those are people who are working with some very big pressure on their shoulders, shall we say, And again, going back to an earlier question, that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. And any user researcher in central government, these are people who are working phenomenally hard, effectively keeping our country safe, and that we're building tools to help them do that. And so, when you are sitting next to them in the context in a place, you get a palpable sense of what's going on, of buzz, of needs, of pains. There's a real empathetic thing going on. And then when you can help solve that pain or take it away or make it better, nothing is rewarding. It's just really a great thing.
Well, cool. It's very motivating hearing you say that, because there isn't if you have just such a strong purpose in what you do, it's a sort of sense of an outcome and the fulfillment and doing good. It's just it's a great position to be in. I'm wondering, so these guys are extremely busy. It sounds like they might be the decision makers. Did you not the decision makers? So some okay. Well, when I mean decision makers, I mean around UX, how the influence that where you could go or not. What kind of? Just give us a talk through the sorts of folks you actually mean. Bring it to life for us.
Okay. I can't go into too much detail because we are talking about matters of national security. But when you submit your passport for a renewal, there are a number of systems that look at it. We don't just go, yes, you can have a passport, off you go, because you might have been a bad person or become naughty during the last time you had your passport issued to you. I won't go into any more detail than that because that is national security stuff.
Sure.
But one of the many systems that is looking at your passport is a human system. And those people are human beings like you and me or anybody else. And they are like super sleuths. And they are detectives. And they are checking things. So are the machines, and there's some very clever machinery doing some very clever stuff. But those people have got a lot of pressure on their shoulders to find bad people. Bad people are also evolving in their ways to try to fool people as well. And so there's this kind of game being played, and I'm sure it's played across any security service, but certainly across government, of fixing the system, people find ways around it or holes in it, fixing the system, and then iterating that way. All the user research work we did specifically was to find and fix holes in process that made people's lives more confident, more assured in that they're making the right decisions.
Fantastic. So did you ever come across anyone who sort of said, Nick, I don't really get user research, I'm really busy, what is it, the kind of they maybe they haven't made their mind up, but they haven't seen evidence, or they've never encountered it before. Do you have a kind of a bit of a trick up your sleeve of the conversation you have with them to kind of bring them around, or I'm just wondering, people might not naturally be against it, but they just might not have ever heard of it. And user research it's something I think you need to have a bit of a background to understand what it is. It's not quite as obvious as it might sound to you. So what do you do? Have you encountered that, and what's your kind of mechanism to kind of hook them in?
For the first 5 years of my career, I unsuccessfully told people where they were going wrong, and people obviously don't like that. It didn't go down well. I got into all kinds of trouble, shenanigans. Brilliant. What works for me today, and what's truly transformative, is role modeling, is showing them what looks good. So it's very much carrot, not stick. And so I have a strong tendency now. I produce show reels. I bring the voice of the user into wherever it's going. But most importantly, and for anybody listening or watching, whatever you do, it has to be like 2 to 3 minutes maximum, low effort, low friction. When we're talking about government in particular, although this is true of the private sector, the higher up you go, the more time-starved people are, and the less they care about the thing that you're doing because it's not as passionate or as close to the thing that they're trying to achieve. So make it simple, make it bite-sized, make it frictionless, and it goes in. So I've made show reels of people saying and doing things that maybe weren't expected or were exactly what were expected, and people love it. It's really important. And so how you present it to people is what moves the needle. And that's so I don't have to have any difficult conversations. I just go, hey, watch this, and things change. And
you're telling a story, aren't you?
Oh yeah.
And it's short stories. Again, it's this whole thing of trying to capture everything, but getting it down to its essence. Very, very efficient number of words that you're using, but it's conveying a lot of information at once. So yeah, quite the skill.
A very astute executive creative director told me many moons ago, as a kind of a junior or midweight, he said people buy with their eyes, and that kind of a role would say that. But he said to me, Nick, you always must show, don't tell. And that show, don't tell epiphany at around 2014, 2015 fundamentally changed my direction in that carrot not stick approach, and it just works.
Brilliant. So we're talking about public sector. That is the focus. I'm just wondering, within the broader user research profession, as with all professions, there's obviously an element of private sector, because it's used in the private sector. There's potentially academic elements to it. I don't know if it's something that's picked up. I did my computer science degree about 150 years ago, Nick. And I'm very proud to say that we had a very serious module on ethics, which was unusual.
Yep.
But we also did UI, it was called.
Yep.
I mean, and honestly, Nick, this is a long time ago, but this is me learning things like, don't ever put more than 7 things on a screen, and just a sort of little trip, and also a lot about accessibility as well, about how people perceive things and colours, and just stuff that when you've got your head stuck in a bit of logic and you're trying to write some I think it was a state lottery system we were putting together for some module. You just do not, your brain at that point, and also because it's high code, so very, very prescriptive, there was no sense of being able to iterate quickly and all the rest of it. But out of that, user research has come through. I'm just wondering whether you've seen anything in the academic space that's exciting, or anything. Is there a bit of technology coming out that's going to, I don't want to talk about generative AI, because it's just everyone's.
You have to.
It's unfortunate. It's a little bit of, well, let's not talk about it as a topic in its entirety. But is there any sort of stuff in the kind of the new tech space that you're thinking, that could actually be very significant for us down the road?
Can I just remind me, keep me back, but I need to talk about generative AI in public sector with regard to user research really briefly, because
Nick, do it, go for it.
It's never going to replace me or anyone like me at all, right? One of those passion points, right, is I've helped youth leaders and homeless people and people who are trying to buy houses who are who have wheelchairs, and all of that, and then the planning that goes on behind that, and all of this stuff, right? There's a ton of work that we as user researchers do. There aren't enough user researchers in government to do it, or at least competent senior ones to do that. First of all, no one of those various groups of people are going to talk to a robot or a bot or whatever you call that, an avatar. Not with sensitive subjects, especially DWP, number of central government. They deal with very difficult subjects, and the researchers themselves need to be that much better, frankly, handling some really interesting situations. So generative AI is never going to replace the user researcher, but generative AI is going to make those user researchers more powerful, because we don't have to do as much heavy lifting anymore. In terms of conversational analysis, transcript analysis, it's going to save hours of really hard work. I mean, ask any government user researcher. We've all spent thousands of hours transcribing sessions manually before transcriptions were a thing. That changed our lives. It made the quality of our lives better. That stuff has a massive mental health hit. I don't think anybody truly understands how much of a grind and how much heavy lifting that really is. And user researchers do some of the heaviest lifting for some of the longest time. And if generative AI makes anyone's lives better, user researchers, who many are salt of the earth, hardworking, making other lives better people, somebody needs to look after us for once. And that's what generative AI, I really hope, will do.
Yes, so really interesting take you have on that. So I'm looking, as everyone else is, at this space, and what does it mean for business technology? That's where I'm at currently. But so I thought I was sort of discussing it recently, and I saw a very interesting distinction. And that's that, and I'm making up some definitions here, Nick, because we're allowed to, aren't we? We're free thinkers. So artificial intelligence for me is something that is very much independent or automated. It's independent from us as humans. It's got this ability to do something on its own. Whereas I think the route where we're looking at it more as a tool to get rid of the stuff that actually we would prefer to get rid of, so we can concentrate even more on the stuff we're really good at as humans, you'd call potentially augmented intelligence, in the same way that you've got augmented reality and virtual reality. So I think the way we should be heading is more around augmented intelligence, where the human's very much not in the loop but leading yes. proceedings still, and actually the view on AI right now for me is people should just be extremely cautious. Yes. Nick, have you heard of this hallucination that can occur?
Yes, I mean,
it's incredible, isn't it? I mean,
so the first thing that I did was put one of my transcripts. I anonymized it. I put my transcript in, and I asked it to list out my user needs and pain points, because that's effectively what I do.
Yeah.
And the first time I did it in an older version, it completely missed stuff. I mean, really omitted headline obvious stuff. And in latter ones, it started hallucinating by inserting very plausible stuff that sounds very similar or associated to other user needs that cannot be found in the original transcript.
So Nick, that's a really good point. So everyone listening thinking, what on earth are they talking about hallucination? So hallucination is a term we've come up for, let's call it Chat GPT, but it's this thing that generates content, whereby if the computer can't come up with an answer, it will make an inference. Probably not dissimilar to what happens in eyewitness statements, where people absolutely swear that they saw the guy with the red hat run across the road, and then actually you look at CCTV and the guy had a white hat on. It was actually a woman, and they didn't cross the road. They stepped out and then came back in again. This sort of, that's what they're calling it. But I suppose because they're not giving it human characteristics, they're not saying it's lying. But it is a really important point, because if you generate that kind of content, you don't check it, you're just rolling the dice. So that's fascinating, Nick. It's interesting where that's all taking us. I think the other one, Nick, is this is often, I think it's one of the biggest misquoted things, which is the phrase 80% of all communication is non-verbal. That's not true, because that would infer that you would be able to give me, I don't know, most of Shakespeare's plays just by making facial expressions. So I think the actual study was 80% of emotional communication is non-verbal. So we've all seen this thing. What's it called? Uncanny Valley. When you see the avatar, and you know there's something not quite right. Although, I mean, it's getting even more disturbing because it seems very close. But what your sort of flight or fight brain is telling you is that's not a human. That's something that's impersonating. So I think, Nick, you were talking about this empathy.
Yeah.
If I'm going to speak to you openly, I've got to get a sense back from you that you're being empathetic, and that's going to be a big part of your sort of non-verbal cues, etc. So I think we've got a while to go until we need to be worried about the computers taking over in that space. I think the issue is the sort of the rush to use it could lead to some regret, maybe.
Absolutely. And at the moment, if you have to double check AI output, it's taking almost as much time as doing the work in the first place. So what is the value?
Exactly. I mean, if you're going to produce a 28-page report from AI, someone has to read it. So what do? Just feed it into another one to read it on behalf of you and say, did this make sense? And then, you've got this sort of interesting entropy starting to occur.
We have an interesting dynamic here where juniors, let's talk safely. In the private sector, there's definitely a drive to not hire seniors and to hire cheap juniors. A junior doesn't know what they're doing, and by default is going to be somewhat lazy and take the easy option. And that means they're going to use AI heavily, not check it, or if they do check it, they don't know what they're looking for. So errors and omissions are going to make it invalid insight is going to make it through into product and services, which is going to be catastrophic. But it's a very long, slow kind of death of a thousand cuts death.
Yes.
You don't learn quickly. You find out 2 years down the line.
Well, you also have this thing called strategic convergence, and I'm pinching this from someone on LinkedIn a few months ago. But basically, they posted up a picture of all the people carriers or 4x4 cars from the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And have you seen it? And then the one that's out now, they're all the same. Yeah. And he just says that's strategic convergence. So I'm imagining, these publicly available language models, if you get something wrong and it's not checked, that we could converge on that. Well, it's quite interesting.
I mean, on that, I didn't really think it through much more than we're just about to. But I just want to say, it could well be an aerodynamics thing, right? It's a aerodynamics-driven design that just happens to be optimal, and everything is a variation on that theme, which makes so much sense. I have no idea how true that is.
Cool. Well, look, I think we covered a little bit of ethical content there with AI, but there's obviously an element of you need to protect the privacy of the users you're studying. I don't know if that's ever been I don't mean national security. I mean more of a citizen protection. And then there's you are, as with all parts of technology, people sort of seem to think we've only just sort of started thinking about it, but everything is rammed full of ethics. I mean, absolutely, and so it should be. So we've talked a little bit on the AI, but have you got any other sort of ethical areas of user research? Because I suppose there is a unconscious bias. I'm just going through, I suppose, any sort of ethical consideration for a human being you could apply in user research. You could go for some sort of confirmation bias even could be a thing that could lead. So how do you kind of tackle that, Nick?
So I'm going to say something controversial that isn't controversial, okay? So I'm going to use accessibility, which is not an ethical concern, but is an ethical concern, if you know what I mean.
Right.
It's baked into the principles, in the standards. Making accessible, inclusive public services is hard-coded into what we do. And every assessment is checking it all the way. So there's that said. However, there isn't enough of it going on. It isn't as ethically. There are still services that certain people of certain abilities or whatever cannot use, cannot access. It's not for visually impaired, or it's not for this, or it's not for that. And it's 2023. There's no excuse. I mean, it's just about prioritization and resource. And I've got to say, the user researchers all in government, that's when I say they have to be better than the private sector, because we work with people of all kinds of needs and all kinds of situations. And you have to learn each situation, each person, and your bedside manner has to be spot on and appropriate, not condescending, not this, not that. There's just, treating people like human beings. And so I'd say, while it's not an ethical concern, we all bang the accessibility drum, if you know what I mean, because it needs to be banged louder.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, well, I've got a couple more questions for you, Nick, and then I think we've covered a lot of ground. It's just first, like I say, just found this absolutely fascinating. Really enjoying talking to you. So a couple of things. So I'm going to ask you about skills and training, qualifications, that sort of thing, and then finish off with some kind of future trends, and then maybe a little bit of a some key tips you might give to folks watching. So if we go back to skills and training, are there? I mean, I mentioned when I did my computer science degree, it was a module, but it certainly it wasn't at that sort of highly developed level available widely. I think it's been around for quite some time. So in other words, I'm not saying user research is a brand new profession. I think it's been around for quite some time. But what sort of qualifications do you think user researchers should possess? Is it quite a wide church, in terms of a background? Is it a background in the arts, in the sciences? Is it the unicorn of both? Is it what's the kind of research qualification background?
You actually don't need any qualification, and there are plenty of amazing user researchers in central government who left school at 15 or 16 or whatever. They're not academically involved. And there are people, I myself have a PhD and a master's and other stuff. I mean, I'm a psychologist. But honestly, I'm never going to downplay the role of psychology for any user researcher. But like I said, it's by no means essential or critical or necessary. Because user research and the user research need in central government it's such a challenge. If I'm frank, if I'm being brutal, it's a challenging role. There are other factors like resilience and influence and other things that sort the wheat from the chaff. So the long-term user researchers are those who can see the bigger picture, who can make networks, who are empathetic, who are fine working with people of this ability and that, but they're I guess tough cookies who can do lots of different things. It's a different kind of a person. Most public sector researchers wouldn't cut it, unfortunately, or many of them wouldn't.
If you saw someone who had those kind of skills, that kind of propensity and aptitude for being determined, big picture, I think also probably with this passion for doing the right thing as well. I don't know if that's me being naive, but that kind of we want to do good here. Is there any kind of training or resources that you'd point them towards? I mean, how would they kind of get into it? What's their sort of, and we can keep this within public sector. I presume there might be some channels within public sector to make a connection and sort of put your hand up and say, look, I'm really interested in this. But what do you think would be a successful, if someone's watched this and gone, you know what, I actually quite like the sound of this,
I genuinely don't know. and the reason why I say that is there used to be GEDS courses run internally, but those were internal training courses for civil servants and other people, even contractors, but they're already in and on the job. I just don't know how you break into user research at all these days. I would imagine one route is to go in as a civil servant at a junior grade and come in that way. And if you're younger in your career, that's absolutely a good route to go. But if you're older in your career, or you've got dependents, you've got a mortgage that's just about to double, and all the other stuff, you're not going to go in the contract route. That world has been, you'll have a tough time of it. Even if you do manage to find your way in through a third party or a supplier or what have you, it's a very stressful. If you don't know what you're doing and you haven't got senior or mentorship support, it's very, very stressful, and you'll be booted out within weeks.
Well, I suppose, Nick, you might have then laid the groundwork or the logic for my next question, which is kind of the future of user experience. But if you're describing an environment that the demand is on the up, but actually entering the profession is difficult, that's, for me, sounds like a balloon that's being blown up, is having less and less. Well, actually, maybe the balloon blowing up is the wrong analogy, but the number of folks available are going to get spread thinner and thinner, but also you haven't necessarily got the mechanism to grow from the ground upwards to replenish and to widen it. So, it sounds a bit bleak.
No, it's not. It's not bleak. It's definitely not bleak. There are hundreds, maybe thousands, of user researchers working across central government, across government in general in the UK. I think we probably hoovered up most of the user researchers in the country a number of years ago, and people who the private sector is in a much worse state, or it's just in a bad state. So whilst I and other people used to flip-flop between the two, these days you go in and pretty much stay in, and people jump between contracts because that's the way it is. Worth mentioning, for the record, IR35 killed user research. It had a massive, ridiculous impact. It's having a massive impact on public services and the ability to deliver them. IR35 was a bad idea. It continues to be a bad idea, and I, for one, wish they would roll it back so that we could. I'm now a permanent member of staff in the private sector because of IR35, and frankly, that's my country's loss. It's terrible. It's not good.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of episodes probably there, Nick, just in that topic, to say the least. Okay, so I think it's just interesting as well that it sounds like what you're saying, Nick. If you want to be known for being great at user research, and you want to work in the more advanced user research environments, it is UK public sector. It's not some private sector
Yeah.
element. This is the public sector are leading the way.
100%, and by a long distance. I'm not saying that there aren't pockets of excellence, because there really are in the private sector, and I can name some heads of UX or heads of research that I've worked with out there in national brands or international brands who are doing phenomenal work. But it's a tiny percentage of that sector, of that world. Generally speaking, government is doing a lot better in the user research stakes, but as a percentage of user researchers, I think we're probably still a minority.
Cool. Brilliant, Nick. So, takeaways. So, typically we've got folks watching these series that are in public sector in various different guises, quite often in restricted or secure environments as well. And so if you're thinking of that audience, are there any takeaways that you'd want these guys to when they get to work after they've seen it, they kind of go, actually, yeah, there's a few, is there a key takeaway to user research in public sector?
It's incredibly variable. I don't know if that's a takeaway, but for example, I don't know if I should say this, but places like HMRC and DWP have got particularly advanced, well-developed, mature, user-centric functions. And if that's a word that we probably should have been using in place of user research, but that user-centric mindset, the execution of GDS principles and standards, is it's baked into the walls and the culture in much more than it is. There are other corners of government where GDS is like the new gospel.
Is that because, or partly because, if you take HMRC, clearly not the first ever online portal by quite a few years, but the early online portal days of self-assessment they were pretty trailblazing, even by private sector standards, the volume of returns and all the scale up that they had to do, the scalability they had to do behind the scenes. Is it partly that, and DWP, I imagine HMRC and DWP have got some very complicated rules and some pathways that you go down that then has an outcome of, it's a very significant outcome for the citizen. Exactly. I'm just wondering if that has driven where they've got to a bit quicker than in other areas potentially.
Again, caveat, this is a personal opinion. Right?
Yeah.
I suspect you're right in that regard. So DWP is dealing with social services type matters. As you're saying, the outcome can be significant, and so by having a good user-centric process, by i.e. making really better services that cost less to run, that have better outcomes for users, there's less bad press, citizens are happier, we can build more services with money saved, or just do more. I think those are probably the sharpest points of government, and I'm guessing, right, in terms of contact points with citizens, those are really large contact points.
Brilliant. Well, Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And everyone who's watching, hopefully we will get a webinar version of this set up in the future. But I just want to say, Nick, massive thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a great discussion.